and one of the original crew members of the Deepwater Horizon.
Chairman Conyers, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to appear before you today. My name is Douglas Harold Brown. I was a chief mechanic and acting second engineer on a Transocean Deepwater Horizon. I am 50 years old, married, have a 10-year-old stepdaughter, and live in Vancouver, Washington. I sailed the original voyage of the Deepwater Horizon from Korea to the Gulf of Mexico, and I have worked on board the vessel until she exploded around 10 p.m. on April 20th, 2010. Since 2004, I worked in the engine control room. Here's what happened to me that night. Shortly before 10 p.m., I was completing my shift and making my log entries in the engine control room when we heard a loud hissing noise, followed by the sound of gas alarms going off. This was followed by the sound of engines ramping up very loudly. These engines provide power to the entire rig and are equipped with an electrical and mechanical trip. They are supposed to automatically shut the engines down if they exceed certain RPMs. As the engines revved louder and louder, I kept expecting the trips to shut the engines down, but they never did. They just kept revving higher and higher. The one automatic trip that did work disconnected the generators from the control panel and plunged us into total darkness. But the engines kept revving. Nobody ever radioed the control room to inform us that there was a kickback or that mud and seawater was shooting into the air. I was standing in front of the engine control panel waiting for the system to power back up when the first explosion blew me into the control panel and into a hole that was created in the floor. A short time later, a second explosion threw me to the floor again. The ceiling caved in and debris fell on top of me. I could hear people screaming, calling out for help, and I was terrified. I did not know what was happening and feared I was going to die. I followed two of my co-workers, and we crawled out of the hatch in the back of the room, which had been blown open by the blast. When I got to the main deck, I saw the fire on the rig floor shooting up through the derrick. The heat coming from the flames was like nothing I've ever felt. Mike Williams, the electrical technician, and I made our way around the fire to the bridge. When we got to the bridge, the captain sent us to the lifeboats to find the medic because Mike was bleeding badly from his head. When we got to the lifeboats, it was complete chaos and mayhem. People were screaming and crying that they did not want to die, and then we had to get off the rig. We stood next to the lifeboats and watched as the fire grew larger and larger. While I think we were only there for about 10 minutes, it seemed like forever. Eventually, we were ordered to board the lifeboats, and we were lowered to the water. We tied up to the Damon Banksman, which was a supply boat that had been taking on drilling fluid from the rig before the explosion. We were offloaded onto the Bankston, and I was taken by helicopter to another rig and eventually to a hospital in Alabama. I feel very fortunate to have survived this horrible tragedy. 11 of my fellow crew members were not so fortunate, and my heart goes out to their families and loved ones. I do not yet know the full extent of my injuries. I have been diagnosed with a fracture in my left leg and damage and bruising under my kneecap, as well as ligament damage and nerve bruising. I have pain in my back and tailbone. I still walk with a cane. I am also having problems with my short-term memory, loss of fine motor skills, trouble sleeping, nightmares, and flashbacks to that night. I have been diagnosed with PTSD. I will never forget that night, though, the loss of my friends and the effect this has had on so many people. It is important for Congress to understand what happened that day so it doesn't happen again. I think it is also important to understand how Transocean manning decisions changed over time. When we first went to work on the Deepwater Horizon, we had a fully manned engine room which consisted of 6 people: chief engineer, first engineer, second engineer, third engineer, and 2 motormen. As the years went by, for reasons I do not understand, the flagging the vessel changed from Panamanian to the Marshall Islands. Transocean eliminated positions so that we were left with only 3 people: a chief engineer, second engineer, and 1 motorman. 3 people were left to do 6 people's jobs. While this often made it difficult to time to complete our daily preventive maintenance, we worked hard and did the best we could. In October 2009, they reinstated a first engineer back in the engine room. That still left us 2 people short compared to when the vessel was flagged under Panamanian law. Over the years, after Transocean began lessening the crew, I and others complained that we need more help. They just kept telling us they would see what they could do. I wish to thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify before you today, and I'm happy to answer any questions I can for you.
Stephen Stone was working for Transocean aboard
drilling mud and pumped down a heavy-duty sealant compound instead to during many more. I'm here today to tell my story not only about the disaster of April 20th, 2010, but also about the events that led to that disaster. It is my hope that armed with this information, this committee and this country can prevent another tragedy like this one from ever happening again. Like many people, I have been following the congressional testimony of the executives from Transocean, BP, and Halliburton, and have watched their endless finger-pointing, blaming each other for the blowout of the well. When these companies put their savings over our safety, they gamble with our lives. They gamble with my life. They gambled with the lives of 11 of my crew members who will never see their families or loved ones again. The blowout of this well was hardly the first thing to go wrong. I was working up on deck helping to pump drilling fluid down into the wellbore hole. However, we kept losing drilling mud, either because the other underground formation was unstable or because drilling too quickly caused the formation to crack. Either way, about 4 separate times in the space of 20 days, we had to stop pumping drilling mud and pump down a heavy-duty sealant compound instead to seal the cracks of the formation that were causing us to lose mud. On the night of April 20th, 2010, I was asleep in my cabin, 2 decks below the surface deck of the Deepwater Horizon. About 10 o'clock, I woke up to the sound of an explosion. I didn't know what the sound was, so I waited for a few seconds to see what was happening. Another explosion went off. The force of it ripped through my body and collapsed the upper decks of the rig. Someone had opened the door to my cabin, and people were running up and down the halls, screaming we had to get out. I ran through the door of my cabin towards the stairwell to the lifeboat deck, but it had collapsed. I ran back to my room to get my life jacket, my shoes, and my wedding ring. I then followed my crane operator, Eugene Moss, who was running another way, to the other end of the living quarters and used another stairwell. Once on that deck, 1 deck below the surface, we ran through more living quarters to get to the lifeboat deck. The ceiling above the lifeboat deck had collapsed by the galley. The air was smoky and gritty with debris. Eugene and I picked our way through the rubble to the lifeboat deck outside. Once we were outside, I turned and looked at the derrick, which was completely engulfed in flames so bright it seemed like daylight. I remember seeing people just staring at the flames. Someone was trying to muster, which means to get everyone assembled and to get a head count. Some people were getting in the lifeboats, and some were just in such shock that they just stood there, unable to move. Suddenly, the flames in the derrick intensified, and that was when people started to panic and scramble for the lifeboats. I got into lifeboat number 2, strapped myself in, and waited for what seemed like hours. Some people were getting back out of the lifeboat, and another person was still trying to muster and get a head count. I was pretty certain I was going to die, so I just sat there and waited for something to happen, for the derrick to fall down and take the lifeboat out. Finally, as the lifeboat filled up with smoke, someone made the call to lower our boat into the water. We unlatched from the rig's cables and motored towards the Damon B. Bankson, a nearby supply vessel. The rig medic there tended to the injured until the Coast Guard arrived about 30 minutes later. The Coast Guard retrieved the injured from the boat by helicopter, which took them about 2 hours until about 12:30 a.m. At 8 a.m., the Damon B. Bankson was finally released to start heading back to land. 4 hours later, and 14 hours after the explosion, we pulled up to a platform full of Coast Guard investigators at about noon on April 21st. We were told we had to give a written statement before we could leave the boat. After that was done, we pulled up to another platform to pick up some paramedics to ride back to land with us. At 1:30 a.m., 28 hours after the explosion, we finally made it back to land. However, before we were allowed to leave, we were lined up and made to take a drug test. It was only then, 28 hours after the explosion, that I was given access to a phone and was allowed to call my wife and tell her I was okay. At last, they arranged to have us all driven to the Crowne Plaza Hotel in New Orleans.